Probably there is no verse in Scripture that has had more said about it than that verse which was already read by the choir sung, recorded in Luke, the 2nd chapter, the 7th verse. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. Many things have been said about the innkeeper. That night in Bethlehem, when things were so tight and crowded, there was no room. But I often wonder what would happen if the innkeeper really did have a chance to speak to us this evening. Imagination is a wonderful thing, and many times by using our imagination we can project ourselves into the past or into the future. And we can think those things that may be profitable for us to think about on this Christmas Eve. I wonder who the innkeeper was. Let's assume that his name was Issachar. If he could come here this evening, he might say something like this. My name is Issachar. I'm an innkeeper in Bethlehem. A few days ago it was necessary for me to travel to the city of Jerusalem on some business. I do all kinds of business in Jerusalem for my inn, which is in Bethlehem. But the only reason I'm here this evening is to share with you the event that happened this time. I'd like to tell you about it because it is my story. Please listen very carefully, because you may never hear it again. This story to me means more than anything that has ever happened in my entire life. As I was telling you, I once traveled to the city of Jerusalem on some business for my inn. And upon my arrival there, I discovered that the city was in a tremendous uproar, such as I had never seen before. There were people and crowds. This had happened before, but for the first time there was much talk and excitement, and people were concerned about something, and they were hurrying things that they would do. Well, I inquired as soon as I got into the city, and I was told that the Romans were crucifying 3 men. It seemed as though there was one whom they talked about more than the others, and his name, they said, was Jesus. From what I could gather, he was a different sort of man, not the usual run. He had been going about the countryside a short time before that, teaching and preaching. He had many followers. It seemed as though people would gravitate to him. The outcasts and those who were on the fringes of society wanted to hear what he had to say, because they said he said something different. I am told also that he was able to heal people, and that there were those who he even raised from the dead. I had heard of this before, and I knew that there had been a man around the Jerusalem area that was doing that, but this was the first time I ever had an actual contact with someone who had seen him do this. There were some who were actually in the city at this very time, and they said that he had healed them of their diseases and their sicknesses. Others were saying that this man Jesus was the promised Messiah, the one whom we Jews were looking for, the one through whom we look for the redemption of all of Israel. Well, anyway, I finished my business in Jerusalem that day, and having a few hours of daylight yet before I'd have to journey back to my home in Bethlehem, I decided to go outside of the city and see actually what was happening there. And so I moved out to a hill called Golgotha, the hill which is known in Jerusalem as the place of the skull. I was interested to see why it was the people were so excited about these crucifixions, because actually they had happened before, and I especially wanted to see who this man was whom they had called Jesus. And there on the hill I could see very distinctly 3 men, each hanging on a cross, being crucified by the Romans. I was told that the man in the center was the one whom they had called Jesus. But there was something different about him that I noticed also, almost immediately. There were no curses on his lips. He didn't seem to be angry or resentful of the people who were crucifying him. He didn't rally against those who were hanging on the cross on either side of him, as they were rallying against Christ. But he was rather a quiet kind of person. And when he did say anything, the few things that I did hear, it seemed to me more like a prayer that he was uttering, rather than talking really. Or when he spoke to those who were standing near, it seemed to be in words of love and compassion, rather than disarranged misunderstanding. Indeed, it was a strange sight to see, something that I hadn't even seen before. Indeed, it was a very tragic sight to see. 3 men being crucified, the life draining from their veins. I noticed that as I stood there, and believe me, I was a little hesitant to get too close to that crowd, but as I stood there, I noticed that there was a small group of people that seemed to be very close to this Jesus, who were at the foot of his cross, and I asked who they were. Someone said that one of the women was his mother. Her name was Mary. With her was a man. It was said that his name was John, one of the apostles. And there were several other women there also. But as soon as I was told that this one woman was called Mary, there was something that caught my attention. She seemed to be familiar to me, but in a remote sort of way. As I said before now, I am an innkeeper in Bethlehem. I'm a businessman. It's necessary as a part of my job to remember faces and to know names if I can, because I've always found that if you want to attract business, the best thing to do is to create a warm and good feeling for people by remembering who they are, and especially remembering their names. And so I want my guests to return, and I make it a habit to try to remember faces and names. And there was something about this Mary that seemed so familiar. What was it? What was it about her that caught my attention? Well, I turned to a person who was at my side, and I said, do you know anything about these people being crucified, especially the one in the center? Tell me something about the man on the center cross, the one whom they call Jesus. Well, the bystander told me a little bit about him. He said that he had been born in Bethlehem, but he was from Nazareth. Bethlehem, I said? Could it be that he was born in my hometown? Yes, Bethlehem, the man said. And when was he born, I asked. Well, let me see, the bystander said. It was about the time of the enrollment of Caesar Augustus, so that would make him about 32 or 33 years old. And then, my friends, I know you may find this hard to believe, I suddenly did remember why this woman looked familiar to me. For this woman, this mother of Jesus, I remember came to my inn one night these many years ago. She was heavy with child. She and her husband were so tired looking. They had come a long way. They were weary of traveling. But I remember also there were many other people in the town and in my inn, and there was no room for them. My inn was filled to capacity with people who had come to Bethlehem simply for that enrollment of Caesar Augustus. But I did the best I could. I didn't exactly turn them away completely. I told them that there was a stable out in back, and that they could go there. They would be most welcome. And I remember the last I saw of them, that's where they went. And there, I guess the baby must have been born. Well, I was busy with my guests, and I really didn't have much time to go out there and see what was happening. However, I do remember that they weren't alone. I remember there were some shepherds that came to them and seemed to be around. I thought at first they were relatives. And some of the guests at the inn said that the shepherds were singing songs and carried on or did something like that. And I, of course, thought that they were just happy because a boy had been born into that family for the first time. And, of course, we know that it's not unusual to sing for joy when this happens. How was I to know? I couldn't have known that this woman was there or that this man hanging on the cross was the baby. Well, I stayed in Jerusalem all that day. But I couldn't keep the thoughts out of my mind. I kept thinking that here he had knocked at my door, and I wouldn't let him in because I said there wasn't any room. And you see, my friends, that's really the story that I want to tell you this evening. And that's the reason I want to share with you what is the most important event in my whole life. Because ever since that day, when I went to Jerusalem, I've tried to, as best I can, live for him and to give him everything that I have, every fiber of my being. But my friends, I also want to tell you that I made a mistake, a grave mistake, the biggest mistake of my life. And I pray that you will learn from my experience. You see, I was busy that night with my guests, taking care of them, taking such good care of them, so that they might come back again and return with more business in the future. And now as I stood there at the cross watching, all of these thoughts seemed to crowd in on my brain. I had not let them in. I said there was no room. I couldn't be bothered. Well, I stayed at Golgotha much longer than I ever thought I would. And the sun was now already very low in the sky. It was too late, much too late for me to begin my journey back to Bethlehem. So I returned to the city, but heavy in heart, and I took my lodging there for the night, planning on leaving early the next morning. I awoke that next morning. I wanted to get back to Bethlehem and at least tell my family and those that I knew what I had seen and the things that were recalled to my memory. Well, anyway, I was about to set out from the inn when I heard the news. First it was just whispered news, nothing more than that. And yet it seemed to be spreading like lightning, and everyone that I bumped into were saying, "Have you heard? Have you heard?" It was said that this man Jesus now was no longer dead, that he was alive. Well, I couldn't believe it. It didn't seem possible. I know that dead men don't come back to life, and I had seen him hanging on the cross just a day or so before. And yet that's what they said, that he was now living, that he had risen from the dead. I asked somebody else what had happened, and they said as far as they could tell, some of his friends had gone out early in the morning about the breaking of day, and they came to the garden where the tomb was, and they found that the stone which was rolled in front of the entrance of the tomb had now been rolled away. And they said that two men, someone else said that they weren't men, but they were angels, that they were there. And when the women came to the tomb, the angels announced, "He is not here. He is alive. He has risen from the dead, even as he promised that he would." Well, it seems then that the women hurried back to the city. And then they went and told two others of his followers. Peter and John, I think they called them. And these two men then ran all the way to the garden to see for themselves. And it was true. He was gone. And then they all saw him. He appeared to the women. And then he appeared to the disciples. He let them touch him. He ate breakfast with them. And they knew that he was alive. It was true. Well, by this time I was so bewildered I just couldn't even think straight. And I knew that I couldn't return to Bethlehem at that moment. I had to find out more. So I spent the entire day learning and finding out as much as I could about this Jesus. I wanted to see what the people had to say about him, and I wanted to hear the words that he taught and said. And so I spent the whole day, and I saturated my mind with everything that I could find out about him. And I knew then that he was the Messiah. But you see, I didn't let him in that night when he was born. My inn was filled to capacity, and I was busy. But I did the best that I could. I told them there was a stable out in the back, and they could go there. I didn't go out to check to see how things were going. But I was really busy. But you see, that's what I want to tell you. He may come to you in the same way. And I say, don't receive him casually. Don't pass him off too quickly. Don't be so preoccupied with the things of your life that you have no room for him. He may come and knock on your door at any time, just as he did on mine. Pray that you don't make the same mistake that I did. Pray that you don't, because it was the biggest mistake of my life, and it has affected my entire existence. And there's something else that I must tell you. I didn't let Jesus in that night because I didn't know that he was coming. I wasn't looking for him when he came. And so I just passed him by and I gave him a stable because I didn't think that he was anybody. And for a bed I gave him a manger, the feeding trough of the animals. But I didn't know that he was coming. If only someone had told me, Joseph and Mary are coming to your town. They're coming to Bethlehem. That Jesus Christ, the Savior, the Messiah that we're waiting for, is going to be born in your town. If only someone had told me that. But I did not know. And yet, isn't this really the way it always is when it comes to God and his Son? We never know when the great possibilities of God stand at our very door and knock. Many times we see only a stranger. Or we see someone from down the street that we've never paid any attention to, so why should we now? Or we see somebody that we say, he can take care of it himself. Or someone else will help him. We see only a stranger. And we say, there's no room for you. I'm sorry. I'm doing the best that I can. I'm busy, you know. I have my life to take care of and my family to provide for. That's always the way it is. Always as a surprise. Well, that, my friends, is my story. But I wanted you to hear it. And I want you tonight to pray that this Jesus will come to you sometime. Perhaps he'll come this Christmas Eve for you. He may come anytime and knock on the door of your life. Don't be too busy for him. Don't say, I don't have room for you now, because he may never come back again. Look for him. Wait for him. He may come to your door tonight. But whenever he comes, let him in. Oh, my good friends, remember my story. Profit by my mistake. And let Jesus Christ in this Christmas day.